Imagine watching someone you love walk down the aisle, and knowing, with everything inside you, that she has no right to be there. Not because of jealousy. Not because of heartbreak. But because the woman in that white dress stole someone's entire life. And the only person in that room who knew the truth was the one carrying the water pitcher. The Calloway estate in Savannah, Georgia had not seen a wedding in over 30 years. The last one ended in grief. But on a warm Saturday in June, the family was ready to celebrate again. Flowers lined every corridor. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light. Guests in pressed suits and silk dresses filled the grand hall, whispering about how lucky young Daniel Calloway was to have found someone like her. Someone polished. Someone graceful. Someone who seemed to belong in a place like this from the moment she arrived. Her name was Amber. And she was, by every visible measure, perfect. But perfection, as they say, is often the most expensive costume money can buy. And somewhere near the back of that hall, a quiet woman in a black service uniform stood near the refreshment table, her hands steady around a silver pitcher, her eyes locked on the bride with the kind of patience that only comes from years of waiting. Her name was Sophie. And she had been waiting for this exact moment for a very, very long time. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened that June afternoon, you have to go back 22 years. Back to a small town in rural Kentucky called Harlan Creek. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where the diner on Main Street had not changed its menu since 1987, and where the Hartwell family name carried a quiet kind of weight. Not the loud wealth of cities, but the deep-rooted kind. Land. Legacy. Reputation. George Hartwell had built a modest but respected construction business over 40 years. His wife, Margaret, taught Sunday school and ran the library's reading program. They had one daughter. Just one. They named her Claire. Claire Hartwell was born with a small crescent-shaped birthmark just below her left collarbone. Margaret always said it looked like a little moon. She would press her lips to it when she held Claire as a baby and whisper that it meant she was chosen for something special. George said that was just Margaret being Margaret. But he never stopped smiling when she said it. Claire grew up quiet and observant, the kind of child who listened more than she spoke and remembered everything she heard. She had copper-colored hair and green eyes and a laugh that came out of her like she was surprised by it every time. She had one best friend growing up. A girl from 2 streets over named Renee. They were inseparable through elementary school, through middle school, through the terrible awkward years that every child survives and every adult forgets. But life in Harlan Creek was not easy for Renee's family. Her father drank. Her mother worked 2 jobs and still came up short most months. Renee wore the same 3 outfits on rotation and pretended she did not notice when classmates whispered about it. Claire never whispered. She shared her lunch, her sweaters, her everything. To Renee, the Hartwell house was the safest place in the world. Then, in the spring of Claire's 15th year, a fire changed everything. It started in the storage room of the community center attached to the church where George Hartwell served as a deacon. It was a Wednesday evening, and both girls had gone to help set up for the youth group that met there every week. The fire spread faster than anyone expected. In the chaos and the smoke and the screaming, in the crush of people pushing toward the exits, the 2 girls were separated. When it was over, when the firefighters had pulled the last person from the debris and the paramedics had treated the injured on the grass outside, Claire Hartwell was nowhere to be found. No body. No trace. Just gone. The official investigation lasted 11 months. They found no remains. No evidence of what had happened to her inside that building. The Hartwells were told their daughter likely perished in a fire and that the destruction of that section of the building made recovery impossible. George Hartwell aged 10 years in the space of 1. Margaret stopped teaching Sunday school. The house on Elm Street went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. And Renee, who had escaped through a side window with a burn on her left arm and smoke in her lungs, carried the guilt of surviving for the rest of her life. For years after the fire, a young woman named Amber Lee arrived in Charleston, South Carolina. She was 19 years old, poised beyond her years, and carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that made people assume she came from money. She enrolled in community college, worked at a hotel front desk, and within 2 years had transferred to a private university on partial scholarship. She was charming. She was driven. She told people she was from a small town in Virginia, that her parents had both passed away, and that she had put herself through school on determination alone. People admired her for it. She had copper-colored hair and green eyes. If anyone ever noticed the small crescent-shaped birthmark just below her left collarbone, she made sure they did not see it for long. High necklines. Structured blazers. She was meticulous about it in a way that most people would never think twice about. By the time she was 26, Amber had built a life that bore no resemblance to whatever life had existed before it. She had a resume. She had friends. She had a story that held together just well enough, as long as no one pulled too hard on any single thread. And then she met Daniel Calloway. Daniel was the kind of man who had been raised to be responsible and had somehow managed to remain warm. His family had old money, the Savannah kind, the kind that came with a last name printed on a building at the local university and portraits of serious-looking people in the front hallway of the family home. He was not careless, but he was trusting. And when Amber walked into the architectural firm where he worked as a junior partner for a routine consultation about a home renovation, he was completely, helplessly disarmed by her. They talked for 2 hours past the end of the meeting. He called her the next day. She answered on the second ring. Ask yourself something for a moment. Have you ever met someone who seemed almost too well put together? Too practiced? Too smooth? Did you trust them anyway because they were kind, because they were attentive, because they made you feel like the most important person in the room? That is exactly what Amber did. And it is very important to understand that Daniel Calloway was not a foolish man. He was simply a good one. And sometimes, good people are the easiest to deceive. Within 18 months, he had proposed. A small gathering at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the river. His mother, Patricia Calloway, cried happy tears. His father, Robert, shook Amber's hand and told her she was exactly what this family needed. Amber smiled the smile she had practiced and said all the right things and went home that night and sat alone in her apartment for a long time before she turned off the lights. What was she thinking in that silence? Nobody knows. But what we do know is that she made a choice. She decided to go through with it. She decided that whatever she had left behind in Harlan Creek, Kentucky, was going to stay there. Permanently. Now. Let's talk about Sophie. Sophie Marsh was 37 years old when she took the catering job at the Calloway estate. She had been working in hospitality for over a decade, quiet and dependable, the kind of employee that managers rely on and guests never really see. She was the woman who refilled your glass before you realized it was empty. She was the one who straightened the centerpieces when no one was looking. She was invisible in the way that careful people choose to be. But Sophie had a past that none of her coworkers knew about. She had grown up in Harlan Creek, Kentucky. She had been a classmate of both Claire Hartwell and Renee. She had been at that community center on the night of the fire. And she had spent the last several years believing, as everyone in Harlan Creek did, that Claire Hartwell had died that night. Until, 3 years before the wedding, Sophie had seen Amber Lee's engagement photo in a society column in a Savannah lifestyle magazine that a client had left on the table at an event she was staffing. She had picked it up absent-mindedly. And then she had gone completely, absolutely still. The hair. The eyes. The way the woman in the photo tilted her head to the right when she smiled, exactly the way Claire Hartwell always had. Sophie told herself she was imagining it. She told herself it had been 22 years and grief plays tricks on you. She put the magazine down. She went back to work. But she could not sleep that night. She pulled out her phone and searched the name. Amber Lee. Engaged to Daniel Calloway. Of Savannah. She stared at the photos for 3 hours. She looked at the line of Amber's jaw. The shape of her hands. The way she stood with her right shoulder slightly lower than her left, the exact same subtle asymmetry that Claire Hartwell had from a childhood injury to her collarbone. And Sophie thought about the birthmark. Claire's little moon, as Margaret Hartwell used to call it. The crescent mark just below the left collarbone that Claire had been born with and that every person who had grown up close to her knew about. She thought about how Amber Lee wore exclusively high-necked blouses and structured gowns in every single photograph Sophie could find. Not one photo showed her in anything with a low or open neckline. Not one. Over the next several months, Sophie did something very quiet and very careful. She did not go to the police. Not yet. She did not contact the Calloway family. She did not tell anyone what she suspected. She simply started watching. She followed the wedding news. She found out which catering company had won the contract for the Calloway wedding reception. And she applied for a job. Now, you might be asking yourself, why didn't Sophie just go to the authorities immediately? Why spend months quietly working her way into position? And the honest answer is this. She had no proof. Not a single piece of hard evidence. Only a feeling, a birthmark she had not personally seen in 22 years, and a set of physical similarities that a good lawyer could explain away in 10 minutes. She needed to be in that room. She needed to see for herself. Because if she was wrong, she was just a woman who had disrupted a wealthy family's wedding over a resemblance. And if she was right, she needed there to be witnesses. Hundreds of them. She needed the truth to land somewhere it could not be buried. The morning of the wedding, Sophie arrived at the estate at 6:30. The caterers were setting up in the kitchen, arranging silver trays and polishing glasses and doing all the invisible work that makes an event like this look effortless. Sophie moved through it all without drawing attention to herself. She noted the layout of the hall. She noted where the bridal party would be positioned. She noted the moment, around 9 in the morning, when Amber came downstairs in a silk robe to check on the floral arrangements, and Sophie got her first look in person. She was close enough to smell the perfume. Gardenia and something warmer underneath. And standing just 10 feet away, watching Amber tilt her head to the right while she examined the centerpieces, Sophie felt something shift inside her chest. The kind of shift that happens when something you hoped was wrong turns out to be very, very right. The wedding ceremony began at 2 in the afternoon. Sophie took her position near the refreshment table at the back of the hall, the silver water pitcher in her hands, completely still. The music started. The guests rose. And Amber Lee, in a high-necked ivory gown with a structured bodice that covered her perfectly from collarbone to throat, walked down the aisle toward Daniel Calloway, who looked at her the way people look at things they cannot believe are real. Sophie watched every second of it. She watched the vows. She watched Amber repeat the words with a steadiness that almost made Sophie doubt herself again. Almost. And then came the moment that Sophie had been waiting for, and dreading, and preparing herself for in equal measure. During the reception, while guests mingled and the string quartet played softly in the corner, Amber moved toward the center of the room to greet a group of Daniel's aunts. She was laughing. Relaxed. More relaxed than Sophie had seen her all day. And as she reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, the structured collar of her gown shifted. Just barely. Just for a moment. But Sophie saw it. A curved edge of dark pigmentation just below the left collarbone. A crescent. Margaret Hartwell's little moon. Sophie closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she picked up the pitcher and walked forward. What happened next took less than 4 seconds in real time. Sophie moved toward the refreshment table near where Amber was standing. She appeared to stumble. The pitcher tilted. Cold water poured directly down the front of Amber's gown. The sound of it was almost musical against the silk. And then the gasps. An eruption of them, rippling through the room like a wave. Amber screamed. Not in pain, but in the animal, reflexive way that people scream when something has gone catastrophically wrong. She reached for her neckline. She pulled at the collar. And in doing so, in that panicked, unthinking moment, she pulled it down and away from her skin. The room had gone from music and laughter to absolute silence in about 6 seconds. And in that silence, on the chest of the woman who called herself Amber Lee, a crescent-shaped birthmark sat just below her left collarbone, dark and unmistakable, exactly where Claire Hartwell had worn hers for the first 15 years of her life. Sophie did not move. She did not apologize. She stood completely still with the empty pitcher in her hands and looked directly at Amber. And Amber looked back at her. And something passed between them. A recognition. A reckoning. And in that moment, the expression on Amber's face changed from shock and anger to something far older and far more frightened. She had seen Sophie before. Not recently. But she knew that face. She knew what it meant that this particular face was in this particular room on this particular day. Someone in the crowd said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "What is that mark?" And someone else said, "Has anyone ever seen that before?" And Daniel Calloway, standing 3 feet away with champagne in his hand and confusion written across his entire face, turned to the woman he was about to marry and said, very quietly, "Amber. What's going on?" Amber said nothing. Her eyes were still locked on Sophie. And Sophie said, calmly, in a voice that carried to every corner of that silent room, "That birthmark has a name. And the name isn't Amber." How does that moment make you feel, knowing that Sophie stood in that room for months just waiting, just watching, carrying a truth that nobody else could see? Can you imagine carrying something like that and having to be patient enough, disciplined enough, to wait for exactly the right moment? Because one wrong move and the truth disappears again. One wrong move and it gets buried. Sophie understood that. And she waited anyway. What followed in the next hour was the unraveling of 22 years of careful, calculated deception. Sophie asked to speak. Daniel's father, Robert Calloway, a measured man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms as a litigation attorney, looked at his son, looked at his son's bride, and said, "Let her speak." Sophie told the room what she knew. She explained who she was and where she came from. She explained the night of the fire and what had been lost in it. She described Claire Hartwell in specific, vivid detail. The copper hair, the green eyes, the laugh, the way she tilted her head, the birthmark shaped like a crescent moon that her mother had kissed every single morning when she was small. And she said that the woman standing in that room in an ivory wedding gown was not Amber Lee from Virginia. She was Claire Hartwell from Harlan Creek, Kentucky. The hall erupted. Some people were on their phones immediately, searching names, pulling up records. A few guests left. Most stayed, frozen, the way people freeze when they are watching something that does not feel entirely real. Daniel Calloway set his glass down on a table very carefully, the way people handle objects when their hands are shaking and they do not want anyone to notice. Amber, for her part, did not collapse. She did not beg. She stood in the center of that room with wet silk clinging to her and looked at Sophie and said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "You have no idea what you've just done." And Sophie said, just as quietly, "I know exactly what I've done. The question is whether you're finally going to tell the truth." What happened next was not dramatic in the way that stories sometimes make it. There was no screaming confession. There was no theatrical breakdown. What happened was that Amber sat down in a chair near the window, and the room cleared slightly, and Daniel sat across from her, and she started to cry. Not performed tears. Real ones. The kind that come from somewhere deep and tired. She told Daniel that her name was Claire Hartwell. That she had not died in the fire. That she had run. That she had been so desperate to escape a version of herself that felt trapped and invisible and suffocating that she had taken the chaos of that night and used it as a door. She had walked through it. And she had never looked back. She had found a dead child's birth certificate through public records, the same method documented in real cases of identity fraud across the United States, and she had rebuilt herself from the ground up. A new name. A new social security number obtained through procedural gaps that existed in the late 90s. A new city. A new story. She had told herself that the girl she left behind was already gone. That Harlan Creek was a place she had simply survived and escaped, not a family she had abandoned. She had convinced herself so completely that there were entire years where she almost believed it. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. What Claire Hartwell did not know, sitting in that chair in Savannah, was what her disappearance had done to the people she left behind. George Hartwell had died of a heart attack 7 years after the fire, at 61 years old, a man who never fully recovered from the loss of his only daughter. Margaret Hartwell was still alive. She was 73 years old and living in a care facility in Lexington, Kentucky, where she had been for the past 4 years. She had a small framed photograph on her nightstand of a girl with copper hair and green eyes, maybe 12 years old, laughing at something outside the frame. Margaret had never taken it down. Sophie knew all of this. She had stayed connected to Harlan Creek in ways that Claire had not. She had attended George's funeral. She had visited Margaret. She had watched that family grieve for 22 years while the person they were grieving for was alive and building a new life under a different name in the same country. When Daniel heard this, he stood up from his chair and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for a very long time. His mother, Patricia, was quietly crying in the corner. His father had his hand on his shoulder. And here is something I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is the part of the story that is the hardest to hold. Claire Hartwell did not leave because she was cruel. She left because she was 15 years old, frightened, and drowning in a life that felt like it had no room for who she actually was. People who study trauma and identity, psychologists who work with individuals who have built new lives under false identities, often describe the same thing. A complete break from a painful past can feel, in the moment, like the only possible act of survival. That does not make what Claire did right. It does not erase 22 years of a father's grief or a mother's unanswered prayers. But it does mean that the story is not as simple as villain and victim. It never is. The real tragedy here is not just that Claire stole an identity. The real tragedy is that she felt, at 15 years old, that she had to. That there was no other exit. That disappearing was the only language she had for the pain she was carrying. And nobody, not her parents, not her school, not her community, ever gave her a different vocabulary for it. The wedding was called off that afternoon. Daniel Calloway requested time. His family's attorneys were involved within 24 hours. Claire, who the legal documents would now begin to refer to by her birth name, was not immediately arrested. Identity fraud of the nature she had committed existed in a complex legal gray area, particularly given the passage of time and the fact that the original identity she had borrowed, a deceased child named Laura Beth Carver of Roanoke, Virginia, had no surviving family to press charges. The case was referred to federal authorities and a quiet investigation began. But the legal consequences, while significant, were almost secondary to what happened next. Sophie reached out to the care facility in Lexington. She spoke to a nurse named Gloria who knew Margaret Hartwell well. She explained what had happened. She asked if Margaret was well enough to understand. Gloria called her back the next morning and said that Margaret had been having a clear week. A good week. Better than she had had in months. 3 weeks after the wedding that never happened, Claire Hartwell walked into a care facility in Lexington, Kentucky for the first time in 22 years. She walked down a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and lavender, and she stopped outside a room at the end of the hall, and she stood there for a long time with her hand against the wall. And then she went inside. What was said in that room between Margaret Hartwell and the daughter she had been mourning for more than 2 decades is not something anyone outside of that room will ever fully know. What we do know is that Sophie, who drove Claire there and waited in the parking lot, said that when Claire came back out an hour and a half later, she looked like someone who had set down a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it was there. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking. But she looked, Sophie said, more like herself than she had looked in 22 years. And Sophie would know. She had known her when she was real. In the months that followed, the story found its way into the news cycle in the careful, measured way that stories do when they involve wealthy families and lawyers and complicated human truths. The Calloway family released a single statement asking for privacy. Daniel Calloway was not publicly quoted. Those who knew him said he was devastated, not simply by the deception, but by the grief of it. Because he had loved her. Whatever her name was, whoever she actually was underneath all the careful layers of reinvention, he had genuinely loved her. And that kind of loss does not come with a clean narrative. It just comes with an empty chair at the kitchen table and 100 small moments every day where the story you believed in turns out to have been something else entirely. Claire Hartwell cooperated with investigators. She made no attempt to flee or deny what she had done. The federal charges related to identity fraud were complicated by the statute of limitations and by the unusual circumstances of the original identity theft. She received a suspended sentence and 5 years of probation, with mandatory counseling. She moved back to Kentucky. Not to Harlan Creek, not yet, but to a small apartment in Louisville. She visited Margaret every week for as long as Margaret was alive. Margaret passed away 14 months after Claire walked back into her life. But those 14 months mattered. They were real. They were something. And Sophie, the woman who had carried this knowledge for 3 years and who had waited and planned and taken a catering job and walked into a room full of the most powerful people in Savannah with a silver pitcher and a 22-year-old secret, went back to her regular life. She went back to her shifts, her early mornings, her invisible, dependable work. She never sold her story. She never gave interviews. When a journalist tracked her down 6 months after the wedding, she said only this. She said that she had known Claire Hartwell since they were 7 years old, and that Claire deserved to be found. Even if finding her cost everything else. There is something in this story that is hard to name but impossible to ignore. It is the question of what we owe the people who raised us. It is the question of how far desperation can carry a person before they stop recognizing themselves. It is the question of what truth costs, and who ends up paying for it, and whether the paying is worth it. Because Sophie paid. She spent 3 years building toward a single moment that could have gone very wrong. Claire paid. She spent 22 years building a life that was never entirely hers, never entirely safe, always one misplaced memory away from collapse. Daniel paid. He had done nothing wrong except love someone who was not who she said she was. And George Hartwell paid, with his health and his peace and ultimately his life, for a grief that was never necessary. The fire did not take his daughter. His daughter chose to leave. And she chose to let him believe the fire had taken her. That is a complicated truth. It does not make Claire a monster. It makes her a human being who made a devastating choice at 15 years old and spent the next 22 years living inside the consequences of it. And it makes the rest of them collateral in a story that was never told to them. Think about that for a moment. Think about the people in your own life who are carrying things they have never told you. Think about the weight of secrets that were never yours to know. Think about what it would mean, to you personally, if someone you loved had been living under a name that was not theirs. Would you be angry? Would you grieve? Would you, somewhere in the complicated wreckage of it, also understand? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell us what you think Claire should have done. Tell us whether you think Sophie was right to force the truth into the light, or whether some truths are better left in the dark. Tell us what you would have done in Daniel's position. Because this is not just a story about one woman in one wedding hall in Savannah, Georgia. This is a story about all of us. About what we hide and why we hide it. About how long a lie can last before it costs more than the truth ever would have. About the people who love us enough to find us, even when we have done everything we can to stay lost. Some people spend their whole lives running from who they are. And some people spend their whole lives quietly waiting for them to stop. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or question something about your own life, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below and tell us what part of this story stayed with you the longest. We read every single one. And if you are new here and you made it all the way to the end of this video, that tells us something about you. It tells us you are the kind of person who stays. Who listens. Who cares about the whole story, not just the dramatic part. So subscribe. Because we have more stories coming. Stories that are real and human and complicated and worth your time. Click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss a single one. We will see you in the next one.